Welcome back to Tom's World Scale Model Series. In this episode, we complete the painting and weathering of our Meng Jagdpanther tank destroyer. If you enjoy programming on scale modeling, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Leave us a comment, like, dislike, or share the video with friends. Clicking the notification bell gives you alerts when we post new content. Or visit the channel Tom's World for a friendly visit for a complete list of all our videos. In our build episode, we found a beautifully cast kit with parts to build 4 variants of the formidable Jagdpanther. Because we didn't have an adequate PE bending tool, we ended up replacing the PE side skirt flashing with scratch-built styrene parts. The tracks, all 174 links and 348 guide horns, had to be individually cleaned up and assembled, so our patience and perseverance definitely got a workout. Despite the challenges, we completed the build, and we are ready to move on to our painting and weathering. So stay with us as we take our Jagdpanther project through to completion. Before we stampede to our airbrush and paints, there are a few last-minute touches we have to tend to. First is this little gap in the fender where the headlight connector wire runs into the hull. Pictures of this detail on a real Jagdpanther are scarce on the internet, but from what I can see, this gap does appear on the actual vehicle. Still, old filling habits die hard, and I couldn't help but fill the gap with a little sheet styrene cut to shape, which is then welded in place with a little thin model glue. Next, we want to attach the tiny PE tie downs to our superstructure. We left these until the last minute before painting. They're very fragile, and we didn't want to risk damaging or breaking them off as we handled the model. These tiny holes, which we drilled earlier, are where the tie downs are inserted. Here they are on the PE sheet. They're very tiny and fragile. This illustration depicts the part at the bottom, and above it we see how the part needs to be shaped. To make the curved bend, I used a very sophisticated and expensive bending tool, this oversized paper clip. I taped the end of the paper clip to the superstructure side to show that its circumference fits perfectly between the mounting holes. These parts are extremely small and fidgety, so I had to do the shaping off camera, but these illustrations show the operation. We simply bend the part around the paper clip. This illustration shows how the part is attached to the superstructure sides. We simply insert the tie downs into the pre-drilled holes, and then we flood the area with thin CA applied with a microbrush. Upon dry fitting, we found that the hole where the gun mounting flange fits into was too small. We can use a coarse sanding stick to expand the straight sides of the hole. For the curved corners, we can use a coarse half-round file. We remove material gradually, constantly test fitting to ensure we don't remove too much material. Our gun flange now slips into the hole snugly. We can now prepare our parts for painting. We start by mounting our wheels on kebab sticks. This permits us to reach both sides of the wheels with our airbrush. We can then push the sticks into a small cardboard box to hold the wheels as they dry after painting. The rest of our loose parts are mounted on cardboard using sticky side-up masking tape. After our first pass, some of the parts will have to be flipped over so we can paint their back sides. The kit comes with clear parts for the periscopes, which I prefer over solid styrene ones that we often get in some kits. We start by masking off the periscope lenses with masking tape cut to size. 2 of the periscopes have round lenses, so we can dab a little white glue off a toothpick to mask the round lenses. The white glue appears as round gray dots. Next, we spray the periscopes with white paint. Here I used flat acrylic white. Once dry, we then spray the periscopes with flat black acrylic over the white. Once the black coat is dry, we can remove the masking tape and we get a convincing facsimile of a real Panzer periscope. We finish by dry brushing a little metallic enamel paint on the edges. Here we've gently peeled off the white glue masking off the scissor periscope lenses, and again the result looks realistic. Now we're ready to paint the rest of the model. Here's a diagram of the various layers and the order in which they're applied. We can see that painting and weathering our model is done in quite a few stages in a particular order. The rest of our pieces get a coat of black enamel. Enamel is durable, so if we accidentally scratch the acrylic paint that we spray over top, we see black instead of raw plastic. The black color also lets us see any imperfections that we missed, so we can fix them before we apply our base color. Alternatively, instead of the black enamel, we can use a dedicated primer for this first coat. We pre-painted our engine deck with our Dunkelgelb yellow, so we masked it when we sprayed our black base. Since we have dark colored detail behind the engine deck grills, we didn't want to overspray it when we apply our base coat. The Jagdpanther wheels were metal with rubber rims, so we want to paint the rubber rims black. Rather than hand painting the rims, we can use this circle template. We tape off the hole sizes that fit our wheels, and we use the template as a mask. The end result is a bit easier to see on the yellow wheels. Some parts we'll leave black for now and set them aside. Other parts, like our tools, jack, and spare tracks, get oversprayed with a reddish-brown enamel. We mix this with brown, black, and a touch of red and white. This gives us a raw metal look with a light rust patina. These will get a slightly different paint treatment than the rest of the model, so we'll set them aside and finish them later. The rest of the model and parts get a coat of Dunkelgelb yellow. In this case, we're using Tamiya XF88 Dark Yellow 2. This color is pretty light, but the clear coat we'll be applying later will darken it. Where practical, I prefer pre-painting parts before assembling them. But since we want to paint a camouflage scheme over our Jagdpanther, we have to attach some of the loose parts so they match the camouflage pattern. Some parts can get permanently attached at this point, like the coiled wire holder and our engine deck grills. Attaching these delicate grills can be tricky, so here's a couple of builder tips. Handling delicate PE parts can be challenging, but a little poster tack on a stick makes it much easier. This plasticine-like material is mildly tacky, leaves no residue, and is available in most art and hardware stores, usually sold as poster tack. We mount a blob on a bamboo shish kebab stick cut to size, and I like to tape it on with a little masking tape. It makes picking up and placing larger PE parts much easier. To attach PE parts, we can use thin CA glue applied with a microbrush. We simply pour out a little puddle of the CA. We can then dab a little onto the end of our microbrush. Then, while holding our PE piece in place, we simply touch the brush onto the edges of the piece. The glue gets drawn into the seams by capillary action. The CA glue leaves no texturing or residue, but it does dry shiny, so we may have to knock down the shine with some dull coat later. Once we're done working with our microbrush, to clean it, we gently pinch the end with a small piece of paper towel. Any thin CA left in the brush gets wicked out. No need for a solvent or any fancy cleaning. And here it is, good as new. There are two issues that I probably should have emphasized in our build episode, so we'll look at them now. The first concerns the side skirt mounting brackets. Each bracket has to accommodate the thickness of two side skirts, so we have to make sure the bracket protrudes far enough from the scratch-built flashing, so there's enough of a gap to fit the thickness of two skirts. The second issue is these mounting brackets for the towing cable. The PE grill is installed under the bracket, so when installing these brackets, we want to ensure there is enough clearance between the bracket and the engine deck to accommodate the thickness of the PE grill. We decided on this paint scheme for our model. Because of the very fragile tie downs that cover the superstructure, using masking tape or other material could damage them. Therefore, I decided to do something I always try to avoid, and that's painting the patterns freehand. Since I'm artistically inept, I hand painted on guidelines for our camo pattern. This was done with a brush using the same paint that'll get sprayed on. In retrospect, I should have thinned the paint more to make these lines a lot lighter, since it was a bit challenging to hide the lines when I sprayed over them. To spray paint precisely, we need a good airbrush. I bought a Badger 150 Pro about 20 years ago. It's a veteran of dozens of model projects, and although it still works great, I wasn't sure I'd be able to paint fine intricate lines with it. So a few months back, I bought this Badger Anthem 155, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to press it into action. I painted the camouflage on off camera since the work involved several hours of meticulous and fine detailed work. This was my first go at trying to follow fairly intricate patterns with an airbrush, and admittedly I found it challenging. But I think for an amateur that clearly needs a lot more practice, I was fairly pleased with the result. We can now coat our model with a shiny acrylic gloss coat. I know that using floor polish products to gloss coat our models is scorned by pro modelers, but it's all I had on hand. When cut 50-50 with water and applied with an airbrush, we get a reasonably good finish. Next up is our decal work. The Meng Jagdpanther decals are pretty good, but we can see some excess carrier film on the vehicle number sequences. Carrier film is the clear stuff around the printed fonts. We remove our desired decals off the sheet with a sharp knife, and we cut away as much of the carrier film as we can. Removing the excess carrier film helps to minimize trapped air bubbles and silvering, which can appear if the decal doesn't fully adhere to the model surface. To apply the decals, we need a shallow dish with warm water and a few tools that'll help us handle the fragile little transfers. It's also a good idea to use decal setting solution since it helps the decals to adhere and conform to the surface details, thus minimizing the potential for silvering. These are water slide decals, so we toss them into the water and let them soak until they release from their paper backing. To position our decals, we refer to our build instructions. We then start by wetting the surface we're applying to, either with water or setting solution. We can then apply the decal using a toothpick or brush, laying it roughly in position. Alternatively, as we demonstrated here on our Strug episode, once the decal loosens from its paper backing, we can leave the decal on the backing and kind of slide it onto our model. We then fiddle with the decal until we're happy with its final position. If the decal sticks before we're done messing with it, brushing on a little water over the area will loosen it. The drawback with removing the carrier film from the vehicle numbers is we lose the built-in spacing between the numbers. To deal with this, we first apply the middle number, then the two outside numbers. We're just roughly placing the numbers at first. That's followed by more fiddling, more wetting the area, and more cussing until we're finally satisfied with our decal positioning. Next, we apply 3 or 4 fairly generous coats of our setting solution over the decal, allowing each coat to dry in between. We can then go in with a cotton or rubber tip swab moistened with setting solution and firmly press the decals on. This helps the decal to adhere and conform to the surface it's applied to. Rolling the swab over the decals also helps to remove any trapped air bubbles. One very important step if using cotton swabs is to remove any cotton fibers which may have been left behind in the process. Since we'll be applying a gloss coat over the decals, we don't want to seal any hairs or cotton fibers into our finish. Once our decals are in place and the area is cleared of any remnant fibers or hairs, we apply a gloss over coat to seal the decals in. We can start our weathering now. The first step is to apply streaking. We use oil paints for this technique and we apply lines or dots of color onto our model. Here we're applying lines of burnt umber, black, white, and light sienna. We'll look at how to mix the light sienna color in a moment since I haven't been able to find this color in oil paint. Then with a wide stiff brush dipped in mineral spirits, we draw the paint down the model in the direction rain and precipitation would run off the vehicle in the field. How much of the color you leave on is a matter of taste, but I like to remove most of the paint. And here's the finished look. The process mimics how rain and precipitation produce streaks due to dust and filth running down the surfaces. This is what happens with real vehicles in the field. Our streaking also blends and softens the edges of our camouflage patterning while taking the starkness off our decals. The process also creates the illusion of depth and fading to our paint scheme. Next, we apply a pin wash and we start with burnt umber oil paint that is heavily thinned with mineral spirits. With a fine brush, we deposit the paint wherever there is yellow or green paint. We touch the brush to all the raised edges. Ideally, we want our paint thin enough so it flows off our brush through capillary action. Here my paint was a little too thick, so I used a brushing action instead. Then once the paint is sufficiently dry, which took about 3 hours with the paint I used here, we can start to blend the pin wash. We want the paint to be just wet enough so it blends but doesn't streak. Then with a large soft brush, we blend and soften the edges of the pin wash. We have to keep our brush clean and absolutely dry, so we periodically clean it in an absorbent paper towel. If we make a mistake or want to remove any unwanted pin wash, we can use a small brush dipped in mineral spirits to remove it. And here's the look we're after. Our pin wash creates the dark gunk that builds up in the nooks and crannies of real vehicles that operate in the field. The burnt umber color works great as a pin wash over the yellow and green, but it gets lost on the dark brown areas. We'll therefore mix up a lighter sienna color pin wash for these areas. We'll be using this pigment powder to add mud and dust to our model, so we want to match the color for our secondary pin wash. Again, we use oil paints and we mix yellow ochre, burnt umber, a touch of sap green, and a little white to achieve the tone. We thin this color heavily with mineral spirits and repeat the process over the brown color areas. And here's the result. It's subtle, but definitely adds to the overall look of the model. If we were to use the burnt umber wash over the brown areas, these details wouldn't stand out. Here we see the burnt umber and light sienna pin wash colors side by side on one of the fenders. Despite using two different colors for our pin wash, the overall effect still looks natural, while the pin wash makes all the raised details stand out. Next, we'll paint on deep chips. We mix up two colors in enamel paint, one cream color mixed using white with a touch of buff. We also make a raw steel color by mixing black with a touch of white. Then with a fine brush, we hand paint tiny irregular patterns on our model. These little off-white blobs get put in locations where paint tends to chip on real vehicles that operate in the field, or you can just place them gratuitously as I tend to do. Next, we paint on our steel color inside the off-white blobs. We have to be careful to leave a little of the off-white perimeter. The effect looks best at distance and creates almost a three-dimensional look. We do our best to keep these chips small and in scale. It's easy to overdo this effect since it looks pretty cool, but go lightly. We can always add more, but taking them off is a bear. Next, we'll add some sponge chips. We start off with a little ball of a sponge. Any old sponge will do. We then gently pinch the sponge into a ball and roughen one end with tweezers. Then, using our enamel steel color that we mixed for our deep chips, we pick up a little of the paint and dab out most of the excess. Then we gently dab on our chips. It's best to practice off the model first since it's easy to press too hard or smudge the application. We want to use a light touch, varying the pattern. And again, we resist going overboard. Use less since it's easier to add than take away. And here's the look after the sponge chipping. Before we can install our wheels and tracks, we want to add mud to our chassis. To do this, we'll be using our favorite trio of colors and pigment powders: light sienna, dark mud, and light dust. With a large soft brush, we apply the light sienna first. We heap on little piles of the stuff just like real mud would collect on the vehicle's lower chassis. Next, we sprinkle a little of the dark mud in the lowest areas by tapping it off our brush. We then blend the dark mud and light sienna to avoid spots. We then flood the area with pigment fixer. We can use a dedicated fixer or isopropyl alcohol as I'm using here. It's really important that the fixer and brush we apply it with are clean and free of pigment, so we clean our brush regularly when applying the fixer. Otherwise, we can get ugly stains that are really hard to remove. Once this layer is dry, we apply the light dust pigments higher up above the light sienna color. We then blend the dust color into the light sienna. This depicts how mud and dust lighten in color as they collect up the chassis and dry. We then flood the dust color with more pigment fixer. We repeat the whole process on the front and rear of the vehicle, as well as any other areas on the lower parts of the model that can be seen. And here's the finished look. We want to complete this process now since once we attach our road wheels, it'll be impossible to get at this area with our powders. This detail will mostly be hidden by our road wheels, tracks, and shirts and skirts, but we want to be conscientious builders. Like the Panther, the Jagdpanther has interleaved wheels, and the rims of the inside wheels tend to shed their paint as they rub against the outer wheels. In this shot of a running restored Panther, we see the beginnings of this process. We create the effect by giving the inside wheel rims a rub with our graphite pencil. I don't want to create a stark bright metal finish, so rubbing over the yellow gives us some shine, but it's understated. Our wheels can now be attached. The wheels are attached using polycaps, so no need to glue them in place. You can opt to glue the running wheels, but we do not glue the drive sprocket or idler wheel. We'll see why later when we attach our tracks. Speaking of our dreaded tracks, before we dive in, I like to make a few of these shims. They're made with rolled up paper towels held together with a little masking tape. We'll see in a moment what we do with these little shims. To assemble separate track links, I put down a length of sticky side up masking tape and I lay a straight edge ruler on the edge of the tape. We can then assemble our links. These links fit pretty tightly together, but the tape helps to keep them in place. The ruler also helps to keep the run straight. We can use the straight edge to press the tracks down, and we press the links together to make sure they fit tightly together. I broke each side of the track runs into 2 parts for ease of handling. To glue the links together, we use a thin liquid cement that we can apply with a brush. We can then apply a generous amount of the glue over the length of the track run. We use a generous amount, making sure that the glue seeps into all the contact edges. Plastic cement solvent gives off nasty fumes, so it's really important that we work in a well-ventilated space when assembling our tracks. We want to wait long enough for the links to stick together, but still be malleable. 10 to 15 minutes should do. We can then wrap the links around our wheels. We can see why it's important not to glue our drive sprocket in, since the poly cap permits the wheel to spin when we install our tracks. If the drive sprocket were glued in place, inserting the track would be impossible. At this stage, we're just roughing in the track shape. The instructions call for 87 links per side, but we can see that my bottom run is too long. We can easily pull off the extra links, or we can add some if we're short. We then use our paper towel shims to hold the tracks in shape while the glue dries, which takes about 2 hours. And here our tracks are ready for painting. For the color, we mix brown, black, and a touch of red enamel paint and give our tracks a good coating with our airbrush. Our tracks get the same pigment powder application as did our lower chassis. We again use mainly our light sienna with a few sprinkles of our dark mud and dust, blending the colors to avoid spots. And here we're using our alcohol to fix the pigments. And here's the look after the alcohol is dried. We can now attach our tracks. It's a bit fiddly, so I did it off camera. We use thick CA glue to get the tracks to sit on the wheels, again using our paper towel shims to hold the tracks in place while the glue dries. Like the chassis and tracks, our road wheels also get a hearty application of our pigment powder mud. Out of curiosity, I laid the gun beside the vehicle for a size comparison. Assuming the kit is reasonably in scale, the gun appears to be just a tad longer than the entire vehicle. This gives us an idea of how crazy big the 88 Pak 43 gun actually was. For the next step of weathering the rest of our model, we use a dark gray steel color mixed with oil paint to depict worn metal. Using a wide stiff brush, we dry brush the edges where the paint would wear off. And here's the effect we're after. Next, we darken some areas of the model. We mix burnt umber with black and oils, and using a large soft brush with very little paint on it, we dab on the color. We keep dabbing so the edges are blended and fade away. These dark patches create shadows, grime, stains, and discoloration, and give the base coat a worn, distressed look. And here's the effect we're after. Next, using the light sienna color that we mixed earlier, we'll lighten it with a touch of white, and we'll use this to add highlights. Again, we use a large soft brush and gently dab and blend the color onto the base coat. And here's how the highlight color looks. It's subtle, but it gives the paint a sun-faded, dusty, and distressed look. And overall, the highlights and shadows create a nice modulating effect, bringing the otherwise flat base coat to life. Before we begin our final assembly, here are a few odds and ends to finish up. If we recall, earlier in the build, we sprayed some of our parts with a rust enamel color. For some of the spare track links, we rub on a little old rust pigment powder. We can then also dry brush the edges with a dark steel enamel. For some of the spare tracks, we use the hairspray technique to create a chipped paint look. Our jack also got the same treatment. If you want more information on this chipping effect, check out our German steer truck episode, which demonstrates the hairspray chipping technique in more detail. Before we attach the casement roof, we want to get our periscopes installed. And here are some of the various tools that get mounted on the casement, all painted and ready to be installed. This kit has a lot going for it, with modern state-of-the-art accoutrements including photo etch, clear parts, superb casting, slide molding, parts to build 2 variants, and so on, and all at a price far lower than comparable premium kits. The separate track links and guide horns, however, for me sucked the life out of the build. Meng were to reissue this kit with link tracks, their product would, in my opinion, be the best 1/35th scale styrene Jagdpanther kit on the market. As it stands, the kit is not recommended for novices or younger builders, but intermediate to advanced modelers will have no problem achieving awesome results, and at a very wallet-friendly price. And that'll do it for this episode. Check back soon for more unboxings, builds, and painting and weathering programs coming soon. If you liked the video, why not subscribe to the channel, leave a like, dislike, or smack us down in the comments. Or visit the channel Tom's World for more entertaining and educational videos. In the meantime, keep your barrels swabbed and sights aligned, stay well, and all the best.